So we're now going to go to Susan Smith, who is from For Women Scotland, and she's going to give us some information about Scotland. Thank you so much, Susan, and over to you.
I've had a rather full-on week, professionally, personally, and in terms of what we're trying to do with For Women Scotland. So this is slightly flying by the seat of my pants. But we are reaching a bit of an endpoint in Scotland now with the GRR bill going into the final stages in the Scottish Parliament. Nicola Sturgeon and the government have continued to press on in the teeth of a rebellion from MSPs in the stage 1 debate and a particularly heavyweight intervention from the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, who said that this would open the door to predatory and dangerous men and urged them to wait the outcome of court cases, one of which is ours. So for those who are not aware, the background is that the GRA was passed as a piece of UK legislation in 2004. An ongoing problem has been the seeds were sown in that piece of legislation because of a deliberate conflation between sex and gender. And there is a part of that act, section 9, which says that this changes a person's sex. But actually 2 parts of section 9, and this was important in our very recent JR, which I'll come on to. That part 1 of section 9 says that it changes a person's sex, but part 3 of section 9 says except in certain circumstances. And it's never been spelled out how we organise that and how we look at that. And then, of course, subsequently, we have the Equality Act, which is the major piece of UK legislation dealing with equality law. And the interactions between the Equality Act and how the Equality Act defines sex has been one of the ongoing discussions that women in the UK, activists in the UK, have been having with various governments. So to go back to Nicola, what Reem El-Salem, the special rapporteur, said was very similar to what the government had been told by the EHRC, which they had also brushed off. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the Scottish government is not open to reason, is not open to any form of expertise on this, that they have dug into a position and they are, in an incredibly bloody-minded fashion, refusing to budge on this. Her comments about Reem El-Salem were rude and dismissive. She called her the person from the UN. And very entertainingly, I don't know if you saw, but El-Salem then changed her Twitter bio and said, UN Special Rapporteur, aka that person from the UN, which was a particularly, well, we found that a particularly entertaining response to Nicola Sturgeon's rudeness. What she's done is she's fallen back onto the funded groups. In Scotland, most of the women's sector is funded directly by the government. So organisations like Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland, Zero Tolerance, Engender, etc., get over 90% of their money from the Scottish government, and they have always been remarkably in step with what Nicola Sturgeon says should be happening. And they wrote a joint letter which was extraordinary in its inanity if you'd been coming to it fresh, but having been around these organisations for a while, it was quite typical of them. They insist that they have never had any problems with trans inclusion over 15 years. Nicola Sturgeon likes to make out that the groups who signed this letter work, as she said, day in and day out on the front line. They don't. Engender do no frontline work, for example. One of the organisations, Just Right Scotland, is actually a lawyer a legal organisation, which is again part funded by the government to bring cases to court. They were the people who represented Equality Network when they intervened in the first judicial review that we brought against the Scottish Government. They also have a remit, apparently, that they will be bringing cases. They want to bring test cases on behalf of trans people who have been excluded from single-sex provisions or jobs. So these are people with a really, really seriously ideological impetus to push this legislation through. The other organisations who signed this letter, Scottish Amnesty International, again, do no frontline work in Scotland, and Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Scotland, who are the ones that most people assume do, but actually these are umbrella organisations. We are very much hoping that we're going to see more of the women on the front line speaking out, because ever since we have been in existence, what we have heard are women who work directly with survivors saying that the views of the head office do not represent them, but they have been very... there is a culture of bullying. I mean, Rape Crisis Scotland have actually been taken to court because they've bullied staff on this subject. So it is shocking that this is happening within the women's sector in Scotland, and that there is a bullying of women who step out of line. That all rather came to a head this week as well. I don't know if you saw the film of a woman at the Zero Tolerance event. Zero Tolerance, again, funded by Scottish Government, and they were celebrating 30 years. 30 years ago, they did a campaign about violence against women. They had black and white pictures, they put up everywhere. There was a lot of support. And their campaign was really to encourage people to be bold, to bring this conversation about violence against women, domestic abuse, into the public spaces, to bring it onto the streets, to bring it into the workplace, to bring it into the centres of power, and to talk about what happened to women, and to be outspoken. And for their 30th anniversary, they had Nicola Sturgeon addressing the meeting, and they sent round an email beforehand saying that women were not allowed to ask about the definition of women or about single-sex spaces. So they had gone from being this really radical campaign to people who were just trying to appease some of the people in the room, as it turned out. And funnily enough, those people whose feelings they were very keen to appease were a couple of individuals who are trans-identified males, one of whom is the current CEO of Edinburgh Rape Crisis, and he was at the meeting. So having sent this email out, we also understood that they were stopping people on the door as they came in who they thought might cause trouble. The audience was largely handpicked. I suppose there are a lot of people within the sector who are aware who the people are who've got concerns. A couple of women said, well, we are going to ask something, and they were told to leave. Another couple of women got in. I know one of them is part of the Women's Declaration, and she was not the woman who stood up, but she did manage to speak to Sturgeon. And Sturgeon's response, which is Sturgeon's stock response, was that this has been introduced in many countries and there has never been any problems. Now, I know that you know none better that this is not true. But what has happened during committee stages is that any conversation about international examples have been dismissed as anecdotes. So the committee's report came out and said there were no concrete examples of harm from other countries. And while we and groups like Murray Blackburn Mackenzie have tried to stress that it is almost impossible to give official recorded data about harms caused by self-ID, when none of these countries are collecting that data officially, that has been ignored. You cannot prove something if people are not collecting the data. So this is Nicola Sturgeon's line, that nothing bad ever happens in other countries. And of course, this did so incense this other woman that she did stand up and shouted, "Shame on you, Sturgeon." And it is, it's an incredibly depressing film in a way, but in another way, Sturgeon did admit that most men would not take advantage of this, but some would. So this is only what most of us have been saying for the past 5 years and have been called bigots and TERFs. Sturgeon said exactly the same thing. Some people will take advantage of this. But she also, in effect, said that that was a price worth paying, that women's safety and dignity and the erosion of our human rights was a price worth paying for keeping some of these people who she claims are the most marginalized in society happy. So where do we go now? Well, despite a lot of promises to look at this bill in stage 2, there have been no real amendments made. This bill was first brought to the table in 5 years ago, about 5 years ago now. The government say this length of time, actually that 6 years, they say the 6 years, the 2 consultations, the committee process means that it's been scrutinised, that nobody can accuse them of rushing. But this is pretty much identical to the bill that was introduced all that time ago, and nothing has changed. All the arguments, all the consultations have made next to no impact. And although they promised to look at it in stage 2, most of the amendments brought to committee were voted down. The committee is hugely ideologically captured. They allowed only the most lukewarm of amendments. They would not even vote for an amendment that said perhaps convicted sex offenders should not be able to obtain a GRC. That is the level that they're at, that they cannot even bring themselves to have that the most minimal, and that really is the most minimal level of safeguarding within this bill. This will go to stage 3 now, which is a general debate in the chamber. We know that they are determined to have that debate before Christmas. There has been some suggestion that they might try to do it on the very last day of the parliamentary session, which for obvious reasons, because a lot of the parliamentarians will want to be going home for Christmas. They will not want to be sitting until late at night on the 22nd and 23rd of December. And this is a particularly cynical way of trying to drive this through. So we do not know whether there will be more SNP rebels on this. We know that the rebels who have rebelled will hopefully continue to push on this because nothing has changed. We would hope Labour, or some of Labour, can find a spine before Christmas, because we know that there's a lot of disquiet about this. But at the moment, they seem to have been the nodding dogs of the SNP, which is a bizarre position for an opposition party to take on a hugely unpopular and divisive bill, which might actually cause a bit of a dent and help their own election prospects, which it surely should be what an opposition party wants. Some of the Labour ex-MSPs who are sorely missed because they're no longer in Holyrood have written to the UN Special Rapporteur themselves to express support. And so with I don't know that they will have any influence on the rest of Labour, and I do not know whether the UN Rapporteur will have any influence when she meets Shona Robertson next week, which she is going to do so. one of her recommendations about waiting for the court case is in reference to the judicial review we brought, which was our second judicial review. Our first judicial review was in relation to a piece of legislation passed in 2018 called the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act. And this deliberately conflated the two protected characteristics in the Equality Act of sex and gender reassignment, and said that a woman, for the purposes of the bill, was anyone who was living as a woman. And this, according to the guidance in the bill, did not require someone to have undertaken any diagnosis of dysphoria, to have any sort of evidence or proof that they were doing this, but the only sort of guidelines issued were that they should be using a female name, whatever that might be, because I can think of several names that are pretty unisex, and be using female pronouns. That is their sole criteria for what a woman is in this piece of legislation, or was. So we took them to the highest court in Scotland, and we won. And we got that guidance struck out because they said it was beyond their legislative competence. They couldn't redefine protected characteristics in the Equality Act, and that under the Equality Act, a woman was a female, and that by definition measures to help women excluded biological males. The government then went back and rewrote the guidance, and this time they put in women covered people with the protected characteristic of sex as per the Equality Act, and people with a GRC. Now, this slightly blew the doors off what they'd been saying to Parliament, because the Scottish government's argument throughout the process of talking about increasing by about 100-fold, they reckon, and that's probably a conservative estimate of the number of people who will get a GRC, is that it will make no difference because it confers no additional rights. Now they were in court arguing that having a GRC changed your sex for all purposes under law. As our KC pointed out, this would make a mockery of many pieces of legislation, including those on maternity rights and on abortion, because if woman was a word that referred to people who were biologically female, but also people who had a GRC, and if it excluded people who were biologically female and had a GRC, then these rights would not pertain anymore just to the class of people who could get pregnant or have babies. So the Scottish government then tried to argue that these cases were different because who knows why, and that everything had to be treated on its own merits. It becomes a bit of a nonsense, because essentially what they were saying was that every piece of legislation had to be weighed up on criteria which we do not know what they are, which we cannot attest to. And even within the Equality Act, they were saying that sex in the Equality Act referred to people with a GRC for most of the Act, except the part on maternity, where it only referred to people of the female sex. And this was the argument that they were making in court. And as Ms. Al-Salam said, they really needed to wait for the outcome of this. You know, we might lose this. We might lose it, and it might be that the Scottish court come back and say, yes, sex in UK law does mean people with a GRC. It will be interesting to see what happens if it does, because that may well put pressure on the UK government to step up and try to clarify this, because it will show that the GRA, the original GRA, was an incredibly dangerous piece of legislation if it really does open the way for people for this to be the case. So that's a bit of a brief outline of the court case. It's more complicated. There's a lot more to it, but it shows why many people think it's important that the legislators in the Scottish Parliament are not making law blind, because if they don't know, and if the government is not willing to set out what they believe, and they haven't been willing to set out what they believe, they were asked repeatedly during the stage 1 debate if the minister believed that a GRC changed somebody's sex under the Equality Act. One of the Labour members of the committee stood up and said she did, which I think probably through the deputy leader of Labour, who had suggested that this would be a problem if this was the assumption. So there's a huge mess, not only within the SNP, but within other parties as to what they believe this thing does. Beyond that, we have ongoing issues within the NHS. We have new S-Path guidance, which has been issued, which is the new body they've set up because NHS Scotland got into trouble for putting W-Path guidance on their NHS website because of the links to the UNIC archives and the extreme nature of the W-Path guidance. Instead, what they've done is they've basically rewritten most of it and called it S-Path, but it continues to have some of the more extreme elements about access to surgery, age of treatment, and so on that W-Path have. So while CAS review has made the situation a bit better down south, in Scotland, the situation in the NHS and within the gender identity service, particularly for children, is still pretty bleak, unfortunately. And with the proposals in this bill, which is that the age be lowered to 16, and incidentally, we think this was potentially a point that the government might have budged on, but it was not a point that their partners in the Scottish Greens were ever prepared to budge on. The Scottish Greens would be quite happy to get rid of age limits altogether or reduce them to 12. So I think there was some surprise. I think even some of the groups pushing for this were prepared to have the age limit left as it is. So what we have is a particularly extreme version still in existence of this bill. And that tied up with the extreme policies that are still being pushed in the NHS does make the situation still, unfortunately, very difficult in Scotland. The checks that are done on people, background checks, we're in a situation where the UK government is actually looking at policies which will prevent sex offenders from changing their name, because we know a lot of sex offenders change their name in order to evade scrutiny and then go on to re-offend. Of course, getting a GRC means that you get an even greater level of protection, because there's something in the GRA called Section 22, which affords people this level of privacy that is only really otherwise afforded to you if you're on the witness protection programme. So it's very hard to find out information about somebody's past life if they have a GRC. So we're in this bizarre position where people are worried about sex offenders changing their names, but they're not so concerned about them changing their name and their sex. And also, because what they also can do now is they can change their marriage certificate. So they can really completely obliterate all this documentation about them. And then they will be able to go on to change again. We know of at least one person in Scotland who has already been through the process twice. So they went, a male who got a GRC saying they were female, and now we understand that this person has changed back to male, but under a different name and a different identity. So both those previous identities then are locked up. So it's when Sturgeon talks about international comparisons, one of the things that she keeps forgetting is that most countries do not have something equivalent to Section 22.